My name is Nadia. In case you can't tell from the title of this video, I really want to talk about some of the discourse that's pretty topical right now when it comes to talking about mental health, especially in relation to body image and patriarchal conditioning, beauty standards. There's an influx of conversation about that right now, and it's really charged, the conversation. I know that it's a sensitive topic for a lot of people, and I want to be mindful of that as I'm discussing these things. I want to talk about the mental health aspect of this, but I also want to talk about our discourse, our relationship to the language that we use to talk about these things as well. And please bear with me as I am formulating my thoughts. I know what I want to say, but this is also sort of like uncharted territory. I think some of these thoughts I'm still figuring them out, and so I might be a little awkward at times, especially because I do want to be sensitive, because I know that this is really it's a charged conversation. A lot of people feel very, very strongly about it, and for good reason, and I want to make sure that I'm taking my time and being respectful and considerate of all the different angles. And again, content warning, of course, I'm going to be talking about eating disorders as well as addiction and what we tend to call self-harm behaviors. Not that I'm going to be going into detail necessarily, but I am going to be discussing them in the way that we discuss these things. So yeah, just be aware of that. Where to start? Let's start here. I want to say, as the title of this video, Feminism and the Ouroboros, goes, I think that we are in a new stage, in need of a new iteration of feminism. Up until now, I think that a lot of feminist discourse, especially on the internet, has tended to be very in the mind, right? And this is by necessity. Historically, when we're looking at our feminist foremothers, like bell hooks, for example, who were some of the first to forge the pathway of the feminism that we know now, that we rely on now, they were living in circumstances where, words were incredibly powerful. Words were the lifeline, and, the power of naming something and analyzing something, and like ripping it to shreds, like ripping a concept or a human behavior, a type of conditioning, whatever, analyzing it down to its root was and still is a vital practice. And I think that part of feminist discourse is deeply important and needs to continue. And, the sharpness and assertiveness of that is incredibly important, especially because when it comes to issues that affect marginalized people, women, anybody, people of all gender identities are affected by feminist issues, of course. But there tends to be a lot of gaslighting. It's purposefully made so that it's hard to name these things, hard to talk about them. And, we don't need to be overly polite in the way that we discuss certain things. I think it's good to have a sharpness and an assertiveness sometimes. And that being said, I don't think that naming something is the same thing as processing it. Naming something and discussing it is very important. It's a part of the process, very, very important part of the process. But processing it happens in the body. And when it comes to the things that we name within feminist discourse, especially as it happens on the internet, and again, it's on the internet, so like we're usually not in the same room as each other. We're usually not able to like feel each other in the same way that we would if we were having these conversations in person. There's a level of connectivity and empathizing that gets lost when we're having these conversations in this way. And even though this is nice because, we get to reach more people, and, there's a rapidness to sharing ideas that is beneficial about the internet, we do lose a lot of the pulse, and I think we lose a sense of connectivity to each other and even a camaraderie, even because it becomes easy to disembody something. It becomes easy to detach from feelings, especially when feelings and emotions start to become uncomfortable or stressful, which they do with these kinds of topics. It becomes easy to step into a very black and white way of talking about something, because naming something oftentimes happens it's a more one-dimensional thing than actually experiencing it. When you're taking a concept, it changes form when you try to apply it in your life, in your lived experience. And I don't think that we know how to handle that part of the process. That again, just because we've named something does not mean we've actually addressed the way that it shows up. And I think that this is the source of a lot of confusion for people, because when you name something, you might end up changing the surface level behavior, but it doesn't mean that you've addressed any root causes. Some people do. Some of us, hear internet discourse, feminist discourse, and we use it to challenge our thinking, to look deeper, whatever. And, we do sometimes go through the deeper process of shifting and changing the way that we do things, the way that we respond to things. But not everybody does that. And I can't blame someone, who might have taken a more surface level approach to the discourse, because we tend to not name that the discourse is not enough. I think that there's so much of a focal point on what we're saying and what we're talking about, and not as much focus on the amount of effort and the different dimensionality of the work that happens in the body, because that part is a lot more out of control. That part happens at a much different pace. And it's actually, what's kind of amusing to me is the skill set that goes into the observational element of feminist discourse, the analysis, writing essays, making video essays like this one, they require a level sometimes of detachment, actually, when you're going through the intellectual process. Sometimes it's actually helpful to separate yourself from your feelings a little bit so that you can name things without it scaring you as much. But when it comes to applying those thoughts and those concepts, the opposite skill set is necessary, where when you're doing the discourse, having kind of a sharpness and even a coldness, not mean, but being a little bit, again, detached, can be helpful. Whereas when you're processing something in the body, especially from a trauma-informed lens, coldness and detachment actually is not good, not helpful at all. The more harsh, the more restrictive, the more judgmental you are towards an underlying pain, and any coping mechanisms that you might rely on actually gets in the way of you being able to address the issue meaningfully and in a way that is going to create sustained change, right? When you're, for example, working with a therapist, which is really helpful with these kinds of things, part of what your therapist is doing, if they're a good therapist, is providing an anchor for you, a structure, a stability of, they're able to, do the naming thing with you, where they're identifying your behaviors and your patterns and what you might be doing to cope and blah, 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 all of that part. But they're also creating a safe, tender, non-judgmental place where all of the emotions, the physiological experiences that you're having, the nervous system responses that you're having will be able to arise and slowly shift out of your body in whatever way they need to be done. I mean, obviously different nervous system states and different emotions require different types of responses, and that's a very dynamic process. And it's an also very ebbing and flowing type of process. There are moments during a healing process through recovery, where certain shifts are easier. Sometimes you're more receptive, and then sometimes you relapse. Sometimes you have to, kind of go back to doing something that is protective, familiar to you, right? It's that saying, 3 steps forward, 5 steps back, or I don't know what the number is. You know, the idea that like every time you make some progress in shifting something, you're gonna have to kind of go back as well, because your system is always building its capacity in real time, especially if you've experienced a lot of trauma or you have relied on coping mechanisms like, you know, disordered behaviors around food or addiction, or what we call self-harming behaviors. You know, a lot of the time these behaviors stem from a need for control, or a need to try and find stability in a situation that is otherwise out of your control or too overwhelming. And I think that feels risky to name sometimes, because I think people worry that if they say that, it's going to come off as enabling of a behavior that might be harming somebody. But I actually think it's really important to name that there are layers to why we do what we do. And something that might, you know, it might be harmful in a way, might also be supporting us in another way. And that's something that it feels uncomfortable to name that, but I think it's important. It's real. And sometimes we don't acknowledge that in such a way that I think ends up creating more shame around behaviors that people might be relying on in order to support themselves, especially, you know, when it comes to having experienced trauma, like really, really severe. I mean, severity level actually doesn't matter, but especially in cases with severe trauma or even just patriarchal conditioning, right? Having to survive patriarchal conditioning means that many of us in some way or another had to like severely cut ourselves off from parts of ourselves and turn our blinders on to how painful some of those things were, how scary it was. There's almost like an internal self-mutilation that you have to go through in surviving this world. And it doesn't surprise me, you know, that something like an eating disorder, I feel like it falls under the patterning of patriarchal conditioning that says that, you know, externally, you're not allowed to admit that you're struggling, because most of the time people don't care when you're struggling. And that's also a truth. Okay, this is again a distance between what we talk about on the internet versus the reality of the world that we live in, that we talk about mental health in a way that doesn't always match the reality of people's circumstances, because we're talking about ideals, we're talking about aspirations, what we want the world to be, what we want people to have access to, that yes, you know, people should have access to support when they're dealing with mental health crises. They should have access to therapists and to medication and to treatment and to community, you know, that they should be able to rely on the people around them to provide them with support when they're vulnerable. And yet, that's not the reality that we live in. Most of the time, people have to suffer in silence. In fact, they are punished when they are honest about what they're experiencing. They're either ostracized, people are like, I don't want to deal with that, that makes me uncomfortable. There's a rejection that a lot of people go through, either with people in their life or with people in the world at large. There's a dissonance there, right? That we want people to be open about what they're going through, and yet we haven't really built the infrastructure for people to actually be totally vulnerable yet. And somebody isn't going to want to address those feelings of instability and pain and whatever it is within them, like the root of the issue that might be causing them to lean into a certain coping behavior. They're not going to want to address that thing if there is not actual safety in their circumstance that is going to allow them to do the work of unraveling that slowly over time. Because it is a very, very slow, it's a fucking gnarly process to do this thing. And it's very slow. And that person is the one who's going to have to do the work, not the people around them. It's not us. It's not like you and me who are talking about this. Anybody who's, you know, struggling in a certain way and leaning into a coping mechanism to manage it is probably doing so because they're not ready to deal with the root, or they don't have the support or the information or the resources or whatever to deal with it yet. And I think that that's a gap right now, right? Where we are having conversations about things, but we don't yet have the tools for the next part of the process to happen. And that needs to happen. We need to build the infrastructure, we need to have more of those tools and more of an awareness of the fact that, again, discourse and actually processing something in the body are not the same thing. Just because we've named something doesn't mean that we've addressed the issue in totality. And I think that people think that because we've addressed something intellectually, they think that that means that we've addressed it all the way down to the root. Not the case. This is why, we have trends when it comes to body image and aesthetic choices, right? One type of body is in trend for one moment, and then another body is trending in another moment. Because it was never really about what we said it was about, right? Even when we were talking about acceptance, right? Back in 2016, for example, we're talking about body positivity and all of these things. I think that a lot of people felt like they could move into that phase of the conversation not because they necessarily had a level of internal safety all the way through, but because it meant being socially accepted. I think that sometimes people, they do what they think is going to get them safety and acceptance, right? And not necessarily because they themselves are practicing a deeper level of humanization, right? Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm wording that correctly, so let me know in the comments if I need to clarify that. But we see trends because people are doing what they think they need to do in order to be accepted by other people, and not necessarily because they understand the discourse itself and like what the discourse is trying to point to. And it means that, on the surface, you can change your behavior, you can do one thing and then you can do another, but underneath the tension remains there. And there's a level of needing to hide, right, your own pain from yourself in order to survive it, to restrict your own awareness so that you can maintain control and keep surviving in some capacity. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I just, I think that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of bridging that gap between naming something and then supporting each other in the way that it looks to actually shift that stuff. And they always say, like healing isn't linear, and that's the truth, and that's uncomfortable. The reality of that is uncomfortable. We can say, we've done all this research and we've discussed all of these things ad nauseum, so like, why are you still doing that thing? Why are you still engaging that behavior? And I don't mean to be dismissive and flippant of this at all, because I understand people's fear and concern, especially when it comes to the fact that there are a lot of young, impressionable people or people who have struggled with, eating disorders in the past who could be triggered by images that we're seeing, and that there is a total like normalization of extreme thinness right now that is dangerous and has very severe implications on your health and your long-term well-being. And I absolutely understand, the shock and the fear that a lot of people are feeling and the reactivity in that response. And at the same time, I'm trying to hold that and say, yes, it's important to name that, and it's important to like be with that emotional response, and also understanding that it makes a lot of sense to me that we are where we are. I'm actually not that confused that, 10 years ago we were talking about body positivity and now the pendulum is swung, because there's more to address, right? We named something, but we haven't actually like gone through the underlying process as much yet. We're still in the beginning stages of that. Talking about mental health openly is still very new. Again, only within the last 10 years or so have we begun discussing mental health in depth. And we're still learning about this stuff. We're still learning about how mental health conditions work, how to address them, how to treat them, all of these things. And, the world right now feels very unstable. It's really scary for a lot of people. And I'm not surprised that, what might be a tried and true method of trying to create internal safety for a lot of people might be having a relapse. And again, I'm not saying that. I hope this doesn't come off as me saying, oh, well, whatever. Not what I mean. I just want to sort of reduce some of the shame around it, because there is a lot of demonization, I think, that happens when it comes to mental health conditions like this. And even, stuff like narcissistic personality disorder, stuff like that. These kinds of conditions that we are sort of considered to be difficult to treat, because the person who has the condition might be reluctant to want to address it in the first place and name that there's a problem. In conditions like that, I think that this person is clinging on to something that is giving them a sense of safety, that at some point in their life, it was the only thing giving them a sense of safety. And to let go of that, to loosen the grip on that, feels incredibly destabilizing and very, very scary. Like that when you're on the outside and you're like, why do you keep doing that? Like, this is obviously not good for you. This isn't helping you. It's like, well, no shit, right? Like, you're not the one in that person's head and in that person's body, and it's easy to name something very different to shift it. And I just think that sometimes we get a little bit lost, in being assertive and naming it, but we're not always aware of how to be compassionate and what it means to actually change that, because it feels risky to do so. I think naming the gray areas feels scary. Naming that the actual work of processing these things is nonlinear, that it's not as black and white, that it's not perfect, is scary. And I think even, expecting perfection in these things feels to me sort of like a patriarchal conditioning in and of itself. That sometimes the way that we apply the feminist discourse ends up becoming a little bit like the right and wrong is very black and white, and you should be doing this, and you should be doing it within this time frame, and we talked about it, so you should have been doing this by now. That's not how human beings work, and that's not how healing processes work. And I think that we just kind of need to come back down into the body, kind of leave the mind for a moment, remember that we're working in a different medium here, to call it that. There's the mind and then there's the body, right? We're doing this in a different level, and that requires a very different skill set. And sometimes it's easier to avoid that, because sitting with the actual pain and discomfort when you don't feel like you have the tools to manage that feels terrifying. But I think that we very slowly, incrementally need to build our capacity to manage that discomfort, because we're not going to make progress by holding on to ideals. In practice, these things will be very different than the ideal. It's sort of like how, when you're coming up with a product or a service, you need to make prototypes, and you need to go through tests and studies and conduct research to see, how the idea in your head actually translates into reality. It's never going to translate in exactly the same way, and that's actually okay. That's normal. It makes sense. And I understand the fear around it. I understand that there's a want to control through the ideology, but in practice, it's going to be experimental. It's going to be different. And I think having more compassion and more ease for either, whether it's for you or for somebody else, in the long term, I think is going to make it easier to handle these things. And again, I hope that I'm being clear in that. I think that feminist discourse in and of itself needs to continue. Again, there's nothing wrong with critiquing. And again, you don't need to be overly polite in that critique. But just know there's a difference between the critique and then the changing behavior. And I think I'm gonna end it there for now. I'm trying to decide. There's something else that I wanted to talk about, but I might make a different video about that at a separate time. I think I kind of said what I need to say here. And yeah, I hope that I made sense. I hope that this came across, where I covered all my bases here. I'm not claiming to have like a perfect execution of this or anything. I'm speaking about this kind of candidly, and I'm open to your thoughts in the comments, whether you agree or disagree. I'm also gonna link some other videos below. kind of covering different viewpoints on this topic, because I think that they all need to coexist. I think that there are different angles of this that are important, and we need to manage the conversation and the analysis with the trauma-informed sort of approach to actually addressing these things in the body. So yeah, thanks for watching.